Hello and welcome to Amy's Opinions. I'm here with my husband Lawrence and my friend Kyle. Today we're going to be talking about term limits for Congress, Senate, and Supreme Court.
Sure.
Why not? So just to give you a little bit of background, again, I'm a nurse, Kyle's a PA I work with. My husband is retired military. And I just want to talk about, how Congress people, senators, congressmen get out, they start making $174,000 a year, which is more than I make after being a nurse for 23 years, 25 years. What year is it? 25 years. Plus or minus a couple of years, LPN stuff, and how much more they make than my husband, who was a soldier for 23 years with his retirement, where they make starting out $174,000 and then they're coming out of Senate and Congress as millionaires. Any thoughts on that?
First, glad to be on the podcast, Amy. This is my first podcast ever. I'm going to try and speak into the mic, so let me know how it sounds. But yeah, as far as that goes, term limits aren't a new discussion for Congress. I mean, there was even an amendment in the works to put term limits. It was suggested and put to vote actually a couple of times throughout history, but not recently. It usually is a bill that dies very quickly.
Well, of course, because the people who are voting for it don't want to get out of it. They have a good thing going.
Correct. And I believe our most recent amendment talks about pay raises for Congress, which we're not going to talk about today necessarily. But that bill, that amendment was over 200 years old when it was introduced in the first three presidential generations, and only in the late 2000s did it actually pass and become an amendment where if you vote yourself a pay raise in Congress, it will not take effect until the next Congress is elected. I wonder why they weren't speeding through that.
Well, the other reason, that's interesting is when Congress first was being paid. Mm-hmm. These were people that were farmers, they were local merchants, things like that. They weren't politicians per se. They were there to serve for the country, to make the laws for our country, and they were paid $6 a day only during congressional sessions, Senate sessions. Mm-hmm. Now we're paying our members of the House and Senate starting out $174,000 just for them to take home. That doesn't include their $1.4 billion for their office space and their 18 people that they can have just for them, up to $134,000 for them to rent a place, so they don't have to pay that out of pocket. That's all for them. And then there's another money for their mail, for their travel, and that comes up to about $4.1 billion to $6 billion that they can pay a year that they just get. So on top of all of that, they also get $174,000 a year.
And Congress, we go into a little bit, but more than every year nationally. I mean, that's not anything new. I believe was the last time we had a normalized budget where we were break even, not since then. But I believe that $174,000 is, just over triple the median pay for an American. That includes our lowest income states like Louisiana.
Median pay is about $56,000 a year.
Yep, 56. So we're at 170. Yeah, right, about 3 times.
Well,
that ranges from Wyoming, Missouri, and Louisiana generally are lowest versus high income states, Connecticut, New York, California. Where, for reference, in California, low income in the state of California is less than $98,000 a year. Big difference for a lot of states, but they're all being started at 3 times the median pay for Americans, with all other expenses covered, as you just mentioned.
But see, we didn't used to pay for their travel expenses. Mm-hmm. They were paid $6 a day. Mm-hmm.
And handle it as they get.
And then when session was over, they went back to their jobs. Isn't that right, Lords?
Yeah, so it started out, they were there to serve. They would travel to DC, do the government's business, and then they would go back home and continue living their life as business people, farmers, what have you. But in the modern age, with the politician as their career, it's really seemed to unbalance everything, and that's how we end up with people getting wheeled into the Senate chambers to vote when they're wheelchair bound and drooling.
Now, here's another thought. These people are lifetime politicians. They're career politicians. That wasn't how we set up our legislation when we first set up as a brand new country. We set it up to have checks and balances, and we set it up for people, average middle class working people, to be able to have a say, not career politicians. So do you believe pure politics is the way we should be going with making our laws and regulations and changes in our states and our country? You can answer that. Lauren, Kyle, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think absolutely. We already have the precedent for it, so no one can say that. There is a limit on one position in the federal, in our federal government. That is, the president is limited to 2 terms. With enough, if they ran as vice president, the president became unable, you could squeeze out 12 years, theoretically, if you were acting as vice president and then assumed care. But 8 years is the limit for the presidency.
With the exception of FDR.
Correct. Yeah. Which was instituted right after that. Yeah.
And they instituted that because they don't want us to have someone in power, presidential power, for a lifetime.
We have fought to prevent dynasties from ruling us as the 13 colonies. I mean, what was, Royal England? It was a dynasty. That's how it worked. And we did not. We wanted to depart from that, absolutely. For a while, FDR being the exception, 1 or 2 terms. That was every president, but that was de facto, not by law. It just so happened to be that way. Every president had 1 or 2 terms.
Well, George Washington set that precedence.
Yes.
Because, he was kind of pushed into being our first president. It wasn't something that he sought. He was just kind of nominated because he was our general during the Revolutionary War. And he did not want our country to be, like you said, a dynasty. He wanted it to be for the people, run by the people. But now we have those limits on our Congress and Senate, or president. But we don't have that on our Congress and Senate, and these are now career politicians who don't have any term limits. And are they really in touch with the average person in the United States?
Yeah, so let's say the average of Congress, if Google is telling me the truth, is 64.3. So about, what age is it? What is the standard retirement age in America that we've set?
62.
Yep, 62 for maximum benefits, but as early as 59 and a half, if you have a 401k and IRA, you can start to qualify for Social Security at that age. So about essentially the retirement age average you can conference right now.
Yeah.
So they're not really in touch. I mean, that would be like us saying, we know exactly what our children are going through. I mean, they're, back in our day is what Maggie likes to say when we start talking about back in our day. But our children, they're young adults, we're older adults. We have more generations in our family by 1. So we're kind of in the middle generation in our family right now. But that would be like me making decisions for my children who are adults who are actually starting in the workplace, starting to experience all this stuff, where I'm coming to the end of my career in another 20 years. And not really with it. I mean, I used to tell people I was going to go home and Netflix and chill with my children, not realizing that was something bad. So these people who are in Congress and Senate who are, average age 62, do they even know what Netflix and chill is? I mean, these are the people who we're electing to make our decisions for our country.
Well, not only that, but just the change in technology from when they were in their so-called prime to now. How many of them really understand how technology is affecting the world and how to appropriately make laws and regulations regarding that new technology? They're so far behind, and it's obvious. The government's always decades behind what the general population is doing and already has done.
So that brings us to term limits. The average age of our Congress and Senate, 62. If we go ahead and we say, hey, 2 terms, you're out, would that be appropriate? Then they're leaving at 68, 72. Or do we need to look at saying, hey, because you don't want to be ageist, should we have like we do with the president? They have to be a minimum age to run for presidency. Do they have to be a minimum age to run for Congress and Senate?
They already do.
What's that?
I believe the age for a senator is 30.
Okay. What's it for president?
34.
So why is that different?
Because they want you to have a couple more years experience for the executive branch. With age comes wisdom, so they don't want somebody super young without the life experience to sit in the chair and fumble it. They want somebody with some life experience. But there's life experience, and then there's somebody who's well past their prime and no longer able to do the job.
All right, so we have these. So say you start at, you said 32?
30.
30, House and Senate. After 2.5 terms of being in the Congress, you're eligible for retirement. You get retirement benefits that start at age 65. If you do 1 term in the Senate, you're automatically eligible for that retirement pay. And that retirement pay is the top 3 average if you're in the FERS program, federal employment retirement, and some, now we have IRAs and other things. But, again, we're going to talk about back in my day because I'm old. So that's what I'm used to. But that's your top 3 average pay, your top 3 salary months, and they average it, and you get that for life. How is that fair to be eligible for that after 2.5 terms of Congress and Senate, and then still be able to be a career politician when you're making all this money that you can make? So you get all these extras.
And I would agree. And I think, how does that scale across the average American's lifetime? You start saving, like most people don't start investing at 18, but that's the earliest, to get your benefits at minimum 59.5. So you are contributing to your own retirement plan for 40 something years. And of course, the earlier you start, the better off you do and all that. But most people will spend their entire life paying into some type of IRA. Or back in the day, pensions were much more popular. Now they're like about as scarce as hen's teeth. Now we have 401ks. But most Americans will have to spend, and the limit's right now $7,000. It goes up every few years. But if you make a median $55,000, you do pay income tax. So you're walking with maybe 30 something thousand. That means 25% of your money, of your net pay, needs to go to just not having to work until you die when you're 65 for 40 years.
Pretty much.
27, 40 years is a long while.
Now, like in our instance with being in the military, I'm just now starting to invest in a 401k. So I have to work another 20 years to get some sort of retirement. Doesn't mean I haven't worked, I haven't been in places, and I haven't rolled over things, but I really haven't had the opportunity to invest because of our circumstances with being.
Well, we moved around so much, and a lot of those retirements were set up for being at that company for 20 years. So it's difficult for civilians to build that retirement when they're being moved every 3 to 4 years.
And I'm sorry, I gave you guys the wrong information. Congress is eligible for a pension at 62 if they completed 5 years of service. At 50, so if they start at 32 or 30, they're eligible after 20 years. And anytime after they've served 25 years, they're eligible for starting out pension of 80% of their top 3 pays. So now, Lawrence, you retired after 23 years, and you only got right around 50% of your basic pay, not including your housing allowance, your COLA, or anything like that. So you're making quite a bit less than you were when you were active duty, correct?
Yeah, I am. It's definitely a pay cut, but that honestly should be standard, and it's not a bad retirement deal. It's just heartening when you see so many people able to take advantage of it and pay themselves so much more for doing really terrible work.
Now, and this is just my opinion, and this is coming from loving my husband so much. My husband's gone through 4 or 5 deployments overseas to hostile areas. And if he wanted to make what his retirement to be the percentage that Congress is making, he would have had to do 40 years. I don't know about you, but every time my husband deployed, there was part of me that always worried he wasn't coming back. I grew up with a dad who was a Vietnam vet. My dad tried to reassure me the first deployment, which was not the best way of going about it, when I was pregnant with our second daughter, about what my husband was going to be facing. But our men and women in the military who sacrifice family time, sacrifice their bodies, because it's very hard on your body to be in the military. There's physical training, there's a lot of sacrifice in the military. They're only eligible, well, now you're not even eligible for the 50% you have to put in for towards a Roth IRA. My husband got grandfathered. He was one of the last ones that got grandfathered. But they don't make as much as what Congress and Senate make, and they don't necessarily, besides the woman who got shot in Arizona, that was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that representative, they don't necessarily put their lives on the line. They're not making those same sacrifices that our military members are making. So why are we paying our lawmakers and treating them better than our our defense against the world, against United States enemies?
And they're considered public servants. I mean, if you're in the armed forces, you're a public servant in that sense. You work in Congress, you're a public servant. And even postal workers, I mean, not just MP, wards, anyone.
My dad was a postmaster and he retired. Your mom took over his post office.
They're not entitled to that either. Yeah, it seems to be just an exorbitant amount of benefits for Congress and the rest of federal workers who also keep this country running. I mean, stop the federal mail for 3 days and see how well that goes. But to get to vote on a bill for 3 days and nobody even notices,
Right.
it seems to be a little bullshit. But I do think I'm okay with, age limits of on the high end, the low end. I agree. I'm 27. We have to grow up a lot since then. Perhaps you get more depending on the decade and everything. But there's not a lot of people my age that I would fully trust in Congress. But there are a lot of people 3 to 4 times my age that I would not trust in Congress. And if we can mutually agree that there is a too young and there is a too old, and we just stick to that, at least everyone's okay. I'm okay with 30. As someone who theoretically can't run for another 3 years, I think that's reasonable.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. But I think once you hit the age of, say, retirement age, you should be evaluated to make sure you have the capability of making decisions that can impact millions of people.
And I guess the question would be, well, not that Congress would readily vote in favor of that bill amendment, however you want to spell it out. But we have them at 62 and a half, 63, whatever your ideal time is. Do a MOCA once a year.
Now, can you explain what a MOCA is?
Absolutely. So it's the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. So there are many ways that those who work in psychiatry, psychology, neurology measure your cognitive function, how you think, how you feel, your ability to rationalize. And it can be very hard to compare across the board. You can get 3 different professionals with 3 different opinions. But at least with the MOCA, it's on a scale. It's a 1-page paper back and forth. Some parts you're drawing, some parts you're writing, some parts you're reiterating to the person conducting the interview. But it gives an itemized, tangible score for how your cognition is. The only difficulty that I would see with that is, of course, besides that it probably wouldn't pass, would be you can train to ace a MOCA the same way as you can train to ace, your obligatory annual employee survey or review or anything like that. They run ask you, if you know what the 10 questions are, you can be very prepared for them when the time comes. All right.
You can be.
The MOCA is something you can Google and do at home right now. If you got a printer and a pen and paper.
But what about where you were talking earlier today about the Texas?
Yes. Miss Kay Granger, an 81-year-old woman. She is a Texas congressman for the House of Representatives in D.C. She was ex officio for 6 months. She had not voted on any bills. She had not made public appearances, and she was found at a memory care facility outside of her home in Texas.
So how
Found, not reported herself, located.
So how did that slip through the voters? I mean, are people just not paying attention to who's voting? Or are people just putting, faces up who won before and then they're pulling the strings?
I agree, and I would have to say, obviously you can vote yay, nay, or abstain, and then some people do not show up to votes. That affects it. But I think that if you do not provide a vote to be yay, nay, or abstain, you should be able to reply and give an explanation for why you did. Perhaps if they had checked up on this, that she had not voted on probably dozens of bills in 6 months, major bills and hundreds of minor. That doesn't raise a concern from even not just her constituents, even our staffing. We're concerned her personal assistant wondering where she was. I refuse to believe she's completely on her own. She has, a detail of people assisting her, most congressmen and women do.
Okay. That's just odd. I'm sorry. And you look at, and no offense, I don't mean any offense to our current president, because we're getting a new one. But there's been all kinds of rumors with the way he acts that he may not have the mental capacities to lead our country. So that brings a thought to my mind. In my opinion, I think our people, our lawmakers, our presidents, even our Supreme Courts, who, once they get elected to the Supreme Court, they're there for life unless they choose to leave, should have a physical exam to include a mental exam to make sure they're capable of making these decisions. And I think one of the ways we can ensure that they're capable of making these decisions is setting term limits. I honestly, in my opinion, if we have term limits on our president, we should have the same check and balances on our lawmakers, our Senate and our Congress. Now, I'm going to be honest, I really didn't understand the whole lobbyist thing until you explained it to me, Lawrence. Can you explain, because, if I didn't understand it. some of our kids to understand it. Can you explain what it means to be a lobbyist?
Sure. A lobbyist, all they are is a representative of a company that's got ties to politicians and either your state government or the national government. And they go and they try and get laws, rules, regulations changed that will benefit their company. Or they also work to get contracts from the government to provide either military stuff or infrastructure stuff or any other kind of services.
All right. So, do you think that those lobbyists have to have some sort of hire on exam? Just like when you get hired out of work, you have to, at a job, you have to do a physical exam to make sure that you're able to physically do the job. What about people who retire from the Congress or Senate or do their terms and don't get reelected and they go to be a lobbyist? Do you feel like they would have to have the same type of exam to be a lobbyist in DC?
Quite honestly, that's up to the company that hires them. They're not paid by taxpayers to do that job. They're not given any federal funds other than what they can get from the politicians. Their biggest draw to get that position is that they have an inside the government. They know people inside the government who they can influence for their company. I think the bigger danger with lobbyists is having people in government agencies that get out of that job and go to work for private companies that they already know everybody inside and they can unfairly change things to advantage that company. And I think that's where the danger of the lobbyist comes in.
So in your opinion, if someone's a public servant and they're working for, or they get out of Congress or Senate or wherever they're at, should they be able to be a lobbyist within the first, immediately?
I would say no. If you're the company that has the lobbyists and you want to get your money out of them, obviously you want the freshest people out of there because they have the most access. But to be the most fair to the American people, I think it should require at least a pause of 5 to 10 years.
What about their staff that works for the Senate and Congress? Should they be allowed to be lobbyists as soon as they no longer work for the Senate and Congress?
No, I think the same rules apply. If you're in any government agency at any level, you should have to take time off before you become a lobbyist.
I disagree, not entirely, but slightly. I think that there should be a complete ban, and you can either be a congressman or you can be a lobbyist. You cannot be both at the same lifetime. I think that they are, whether we like it or not, they are intertwined, they go hand in hand, actually in the modern age. But I think that the best way to prevent that is to prevent the mixing of the two entirely. So if they were to pass that no further, those that are currently ex-congressmen, current lobbyists, 1 calendar year to remove themselves from that role, I would say, for the day of passage. There are, I don't like to deal in absolutes. An absolute, I think that it should be.
Okay. So, how long do you think a term should be for Congress or Senate?
So I know that they alternate, they have what they call gubernatorial elections, states on their own schedule for their representatives, as well as for the federal, they can be together or separate. It varies greatly. And I'm from Pennsylvania. I do not yet know the North Carolina. I know I did it last time here in North Carolina, but I forget what the schedule is. So I just need, I'm vulnerable to the mail reminders.
So on average, not average, Congress serves 2.5 years. Senate serves 5 years. Regardless of when they're elected and the rotation, if we put term limits on it, do you feel like we should vote like we do for the president, where everyone votes all at once and have it every 4 years? Or do you feel like the rotating elections help keep the president with checks and balances better?
I think in terms of checks and balances, I think it should be, I think November, I think election day, 1 calendar year here in the United States, I think that should be when we vote for everything. Now, obviously, we don't elect the president every year, it's every 4. But if we're going to do annual elections, I think that it should be a federal holiday, that everything should come to a standstill except for emergency and necessary services, and that is the day that everyone can go and vote. I know it's, the hair-raising to watch votes come in during the presidential election, but I would argue it's more agonizing the 8 to 12 weeks, even 16 weeks leading up to the watching who's going to get what each state, who's in the primaries and such.
Okay.
No, I think it should be, you can do some primaries, but I think it should be all at once in the general election, once a year.
Okay.
And I think it's respectful to the American workers. They can count on that day. It's always guaranteed.
Now, do you think Congress and Senate should have the same term length?
Yes, I think that's fine, but if I care more for consistency, however. So if we were to do Senate is 2 years, Congress is 3 years, as long as we stick with it, you don't change it because people will want to manipulate it. As long as we have a firm plan, this is what it is, and unless something dramatically changes, we could keep it. So I don't mind having the Senate and House of Reps having different term limit or term, years term.
Okay.
I'm okay.
And do you agree that do you not agree, but what are your thoughts? How many terms should they be limited to?
I think it should be the entire United States federal Congress. You get 3 in any combination. You can be in the House for 2, sit in 1, House all 3, sit all 3, any combination. Once you hit your 3 full terms, that's it. And as it's important, no lobbying. You go home to your constituents and work a real job.
Lawrence?
So I'm all right with the current terms and how they let out. With the House of Representatives, you want your representatives with a short term. It helps the people hold them accountable. If you vote somebody in and they've got a decade for a term, well, there goes any power over them. You can't vote them out and get rid of them. The Senate used to be voted on by each state, by their legislature, and that's how they'd elect it. But I believe it was the 17th Amendment that changed it to have a general. That's kind of the reason why their term lengths were different to begin with. The senators were actually supposed to represent their state. They weren't there to represent necessarily the people. And that's what your representatives were for. We've kind of merged the two more or less since they changed the amendment and made it so it's a general election for your Senate as well. But I think lengthening the terms would be a bad idea as far as the representatives go. But I do believe that term limits should be enacted. It's got overwhelming support among the citizens of the country. The only people who vehemently oppose it are the elected officials themselves.
Now, that brings another question to mind. I feel that, the majority, we have 2 major parties, the Republican and Democrats. And I feel they're very similar now to what their policies are and what their beliefs are to a degree. And what you're just saying is that the representatives were elected to represent the people, and the Senate was elected to represent the state. Not necessarily the voice of the people, but now they're kind of melded together. So are we treating our Congress and Senate, our representatives and our senators, like we've done with our political parties? Do we need to have a look at that and say, hey, we have this set up, so we have the president up here, the Congress and the Senate are the checks and balances. I mean, we have a 3-way check and balance. But you're saying they're essentially now doing the same thing. Is that what I'm hearing?
Not necessarily. The legislation was always a branch of the government, the legislative branch. So you've got the executive, which is the president, the judicial, which is your Supreme Court. The legislative body was broken up into your House and your Senate. So those two coming together, that's more political maneuvering than anything. But what they do is each body still does their original function. It's just how they get elected has been changed.
Okay.
Do you think there should be, we talked about term limits as well as the actual terms themselves or the total number. Do you think, like in some states, there is REAP? For example, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, was subject to a recall vote. They said, no, we don't want this. We want him removed. Should Congress have a nationally recognized REAP vote then?
I'll let you have
If we're going to have longer terms, I know you're against longer terms, I'm in agreement with that. But if the argument was, should we have a REAP process?
We could, but I'm pretty sure we already have a means of removing them if they are doing something. But it's not by the people; it's by the House itself. it wouldn't be a bad idea to have something that the people can bring midterm to remove them if necessary.
Right. Right. I know the internal House Committee can censure and remove. Absolutely. I think a constituent-based recall would be reasonable.
But who would bring that about? Who would say, "Hey, I want to recall this person"?
Similar to how they do it by the states, by petition, getting signatures, But I would also put a limit on the recall, because if someone really doesn't like somebody, you can eventually garner enough signatures to continuously call it a recall vote. I think there should be one recall. And the thing is, you can't subject someone to double jeopardy. You can't subject someone to double recall. Either the vote passes or it does not. Because then, you'll have very, hot states, Texas or New York, where you have them fighting like cats and dogs. They would want to recall everybody all the time. They would drive us to the wall, I suspect.
So my personal opinion, and again, this is all opinions. We're not trying to educate anyone really. It's just our opinions on this stuff. My personal opinion, I think Congress and Senate should be 2.5 years, period. I don't think they should. I think they should be elected, at the half-year mark. So say Congress, we do the election there and then 1.5 years later, we do election for Senate. So that way we're constantly trying to balance out that branch. As far as a recall vote, I think we have to be more transparent. Our senators and our elected officials have to be more transparent with everything they're doing. I think that would be more proficient from a standpoint instead of having someone with sour grapes. I didn't really like this candidate, so I'm not going to go on, we're upset. Look at what they've done with President Trump and President Biden in the last 4 years. We're going to charge them with crimes, we're going to do all this other stuff. I think that would be a risk with having recall. Because we would have someone, hey, I didn't like this person, I don't like how they are. I honestly think the media pushes a lot of that. Because the media, to me, is not biased right now. Or is not unbiased. They're very biased with what they release.
You're not.
Because, the media puts out what they like, and they really push for that. And if they don't like someone, are they going to push for those recall votes? And you have this younger generation who's attached to their phones, attached to the social media stuff, and they're hearing these things. Is that going to change their opinions? So with the recall vote, for me, I think a better way of doing that is to stagger. Right now Senate's 5 years, Congress 2.5 years. But shortening it to Senate only doing 2.5 years and stagger them so every year and a half or every, about 2 years, we're bringing someone else new in.
Yeah,
that's my personal opinion.
I think that's reasonable. Like I said, earlier, my real thing is, as long as we're keeping the Senate terms the same, the congressional term, all congressional terms the same, whether it's 2.5 or 3.5, we can alternate them. I'm okay with that, as long as we just don't change the length of each term. Senators now are 2, next are 6, now they're down to 5. As long as we're not jumping that, I think that's a reasonable option. There's a couple of reasonable ways, and I think that could be a part of it. In lieu of recall process, I think that would be good.
And that's just my opinion. And I also think that a 2-term or 3, I think we can go up to 3 terms if we're shortening the length of time. So say they're only in public service for 8 years, max 8 years, 2.5 years, 2.5 years, whatever. Let's just say 8 years, just go 8 years. I think that's fine, but I think like any other job that you have to put part of your money away into a Roth IRA or your own retirement plan. I don't think you should be necessarily eligible. I think you can roll over into your private retirement plan. I don't think you should be eligible for retirement with that short of public service.
I think in the military they have it, I have a 403B with my work. Many people have a 401k and employer sponsored plan. I believe it's called a TSP in the Army, correct? A thrift savings plan?
It is, that's correct.
And then usually the limits out the same. The IRS board decides all this, Congress decides, but the IRS handles it. So it's usually, you can save as much a year of 401k or 403B and a TSP. You have the same limit, right? Approximately.
Yep, you do. You can put as much as you want into it. The government's only going to match a certain percentage.
Right. And then every American citizen based on income can have either a Roth or a traditional IRA or both, depending on your income if it's borderline. I don't think they should be entitled to anything further than what they offer their constituents at that limit. And of course, you could have a private brokerage where you can trade stocks while you're in Congress, but I think they should not get any additional tax advantage plans in the constituents.
No, absolutely not. Every law that they make, they should be subject to themselves. And you can tell most of the bad laws because they exempt themselves.
Yes, absolutely.
I would also go one step further. I think that they should be paid the median pay for their states. I think they should take the median pay for their state. They're representing, oh my goodness, they're representing, thank you, representing the people of their state in DC. I don't think they should be representing the higher end or the lower end. I think they should have that median wage pay so they're more in touch with what people need. I think having all these billions of dollars, I think that should come out of the government fund, and government should pay their staff. I don't think it should be given to each representative to pay their own staff. I think that should be handled from a whole different ballgame. But as far as what they make, and they should only make that money when Congress and Senate is in session. If they're not in session, they shouldn't be pulling a paycheck for a year. They should only be pulling a paycheck while they're in session.
I think they could continue. So I agree that there should be a limit on their income. 174 is a lot. You're a public servant. I don't think you should pay glamorously. And 174 should be glamorous with an immediate, we said 55K or so. Yeah, that's pretty glamorous in the grand scheme of it. I think they should be paid at regular intervals year round in the same sense that teachers pay regular intervals, even if they're off June, July, August. I think that's reasonable. But the limit should exist, so we can say your salary for one calendar year is X number of dollars. Divide it into 26 for bi-weekly pay. Do with that as you like.
Fair enough, Lawrence.
I'd be willing to say that it should be illegal for them to live in DC. They should have to live in their home state, and when they're out of session, they should be back home.
Well, and look at what we have with technology now. I mean, we can have, like for instance, you came over here today to do this, but my sister did a podcast with me, and she lives in Arizona. We have Zoom, we have other ways of communicating. Do we all have to be in the same building? Do they have to be in the same building to cast a vote? Well, do they have to travel to DC anymore? Is that actually something that's needed?
I think in the age, without going too far off to left field, I think in the age of cybersecurity and cybercrime, in-person voting should be done, where each congressman can verify who they are. I would worry about, we talk about cyber attacks from foreign nations that do not have our interests in mind. If we vote electronically, I think that would introduce a lot of disgruntled opinions about remote voting. I think.
Do they vote with pen and paper?
Depends. Sometimes they won't do a physical vote. They will call out each person as yay or nay. It depends on certain internal bills. They do a live call out vote. Everything. But in person, there is a actually in the Senate. You press for yay, nay, or abstain.
Okay.
And at least you can look when you say, that's Senator John Smith from Ohio. He's there. He's there.
So, if they have to travel to DC, do you believe they need the travel benefits that they get?
Not if they're making $174,000 a year.
Amtrak is $90 in Miami.
All right. So we're gonna wrap this up. I know we've talked about a lot of things, and there's a lot to think about. We're gonna let Lawrence start with his opinions on term limits and everything that we've talked about, and then we'll go to Kyle and then with me, Lawrence.
I think every sitting politician should have a term limit. There should be no question to it. It's really a no-brainer. They shouldn't be in there for 40 plus years. That's ridiculous. But I also think that there should be term limits imposed in the government bureaucracies as well. It's just because your politicians are changing out doesn't mean there's going to be changes in the bureaucracies. So as far as that goes, they can be longer terms of service, but they should still have term limits.
What about medical checks?
I don't know what you're talking about.
Medical and
mental wellness checks.
They're fit for service.
Sure. I mean, after retirement age, it's fine, but then you get into the there's some really dumb people sitting in Congress too. Should they have an IQ test to make sure that they're smart enough to serve?
No, I'm not saying IQ. I mean, you had to have physicals in the military as public service member.
Well, sure, we had to take a test to make sure we were smart enough to be able to follow instruction too. I think it might not be a bad idea to start doing that with our elected officials.
Okay. Kyle?
Yeah, I think in the executive branch we have a reasonable age check and balance. There's a minimum age, there's no maximum age. You do get 2 terms. I think that's adequate enough.
Now, do you think we don't have a maximum age because people don't used to live as long as they do now?
Oh, absolutely. Teddy Roosevelt was considered a dinosaur at 44. And now we look at him as one of our youngest presidents.
We're dinosaurs.
That was 100 years ago. It was 100 years ago when people were dying of tuberculosis in the street. Not opposed to now where the average life expectancy is 82, 83 in the U.S. Yeah, I think that's fine. In terms of Congress, absolutely term limits. I say 3 Congress, however you spice it up or get elected, that's fine. In terms of age limits, 30 is the minimum, reasonable. Keep it as it is. For people, I would say either 70 or 75. I think that should be the upper limit, because you can be Medicare age and still be very, if we're going to have a minimum, we should have we didn't disclose the exact number, but I agree. You either get a TSP, your own private IRA, no additional benefits. You get what your constituents have access to. That's my thought. In terms of the Supreme Court, I think there should be an age limit because they're appointed for life. You may get to the natural age of 80. At least when you're 70, 2 years. So you want 2 times, you want to leave, that's on you as the Supreme Court justice.
So we may have to do another one about Supreme Court.
No,
Just
yeah.
saying,
There's more episodes to come. But yeah, I think there's term limits, absolutely. For both age and number of terms you can serve.
Fair enough. Now, again, this is called Amy's Opinions, even though we have multiple people talking about stuff. So, in my opinion is always the best. That's just my opinion. I believe term limits are needed. I think right now our legislative branch has gotten out of control. We have politicians that are life career politicians that aren't necessarily in touch with what we need. We have politicians who are showing up in memory care units. We're having politicians who are making more money than I make after being a nurse for 25 years. And gosh darn it, I don't think that's fair. That have politicians who are retiring with more money than my husband's made in his retirement. And he's gone overseas and fought for our country and for the rights of our people. I don't think that's fair. But again, these are just my opinions. I agree with an age limit. I honestly think, just like any job you do, you should have a physical and mental check and make sure you're qualified to do the job that you're hired to do or you're elected to do. So in my opinion, term limits, yes, I agree with Kyle. I think 3 is a good one. I think that's average. President can have 2 terms of 8 years. Congress and Senate, 6 years, 8 years. I think that's good to have checks and balances that way, and we need that. And that's just my opinion. So thank you very much for joining us today. I appreciate you, Kyle. Lawrence, thank you for trying to get on camera, even though you tried to get off.
Good to be here.
And if you have any opinions of your own, please drop them below, and we'll see you guys next time. Have a good day.